All right, I believe that we are back on for our next segment with the amazing Mark Sleboda, who is a geopolitical expert and a veteran. And I'm really, looking forward to talking to him about what he thinks about the developments, especially between Ecuador and the United States since our last vigil. So welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me again.
So before we get into those questions about, the sort of geopolitical scene that is surrounding or has developed since the last stream, can you just tell the audience a little bit about your experience, as a veteran and as a supporter of WikiLeaks and a geopolitical expert, and what sort of drew you to support WikiLeaks?
Yeah. Okay. So for those who weren't with us during the last vigil, I am a U.S. military vet. I served 6 years in the U.S. Navy in the nuclear engineering field. And that experience is perhaps the start of my, shall we say, growth of dissent and disenchantment with what the United States is doing militarily and foreign policy wise around the world. WikiLeaks in particular, now I have to say I am not an info utopian. I made my peace long ago that as a international affairs and security analyst, I gave up privacy. I believe that most of us that have public personas online, where we're constantly putting under our own names our information out there, we've already sacrificed privacy. Privacy, unfortunately, is a thing of the past. I've come to make my peace with that. Maybe other people haven't, but I go from that. I assume that all my communications are always being monitored, probably by multiple entities, or at least have the capability of being monitored if I were to ever say anything that might interest these people. And that goes for email, telephone, anything, that isn't passed by carrier pigeon, probably, and maybe even that. So I'm not an info utopian. I don't believe in absolute freedom of information and speech. I'm a statist. I actually believe that the state has certain extraordinary situations where they have to look. And, we've seen multiple acts of real terrorism where it is behooving of security to intercept communications, monitor people, and so on. But obviously, the United States, the cabal of the Five Eyes network with the United States, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada have gone way beyond with PRISM and so on. They're monitoring everything in the world.
Well, I think that's a really great point. And I think that coming from that perspective, it's even more, moving that you're here with us and that you're supporting WikiLeaks, because so many people would construe that type of stance as somebody who would be against WikiLeaks, but here you are. And I think that part of the reason that, WikiLeaks doesn't really counter what those values that you just described is because, as I mentioned with Tim earlier, WikiLeaks goes to great lengths to make sure that they do redact, sensitive information. When they published Vault 7, they made sure that they didn't publish like active, weaponized versions of what they published. They very consciously went through and made sure that they weren't putting weapons in the hands of, every teenage hacker across the planet. So can you explain for us why it is that you've decided to support WikiLeaks with the stances you hold on, freedom of information, privacy, etc.?
Yeah, well, part of my disenchantment with the U.S. has to do with what can only be described, as the U.S. pursuit of global military hegemony, with on top of its already, cyber surveillance state that encompasses the whole world. We've already talked about that. U.S. military has some 1,000+ military bases around the world. there's only actually 30 some countries in the world that do not have U.S. special forces currently stationed or operating in these countries, and the U.S. Military budget is, so much greater than any of its peer competitors by an order of magnitude, and most of the other top 10 military spenders in that category are its allies. I mean, we're looking at number 2 now is China. Okay, that's a competitor. The number 3 biggest spender on military is actually Saudi Arabia, and they're buying most of their weapons from the U.S. and the U.K. industrial complex. And then, of course, there's the United Kingdom and France and, South Korea, Japan. The whole top 10 countries, this forms a gigantic military bloc. And it's been aggressive. There's no question about it. I mean, you can start as early back as Serbia and the dismemberment of Kosovo and turning it into a NATO protectorate. Essentially, that's what it still is, still run by the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was recognized by the U.S. government and other governments as a terrorist organization up until it suddenly became geopolitically useful for them, and right before the U.S. backed them and bombed them into power in Kosovo. Their president right now, has had very credible charges, even under European Council reports of organ smuggling, which doesn't actually mean just smuggling. It means human butchery.
Absolutely.
They caught and then smuggling. So Kosovo, Iraq. All right, that enters into my time frame there. We've seen the longest U.S. war in history, the military occupation of Afghanistan. Occupying an entire country for 2 decades is hardly appropriate response to terrorism. And then we have Libya and Syria, and Yemen is going on. And this is obviously a hegemon that's not only out of control, but doing incredible destabilizing damage to not only the Middle East right now, but the entire world through its actions. And one of the things that WikiLeaks has done from very beginning, from Private Manning's releases onward, we talked a lot about this in my Vigil last month, that a lot of WikiLeaks is focused particularly on the United States as the world's hegemon, or would-be hegemon, suzerain, if you want to call it that. WikiLeaks has exposed, through its things, what can only be called war crimes, right? And that's just the tip of the iceberg with the files that Private Manning released, with the intelligence files, the U.S. State Department files, that revealed a deep look into how the U.S. State Department works around the world. And it's not at all a pretty thing. It is, of course, a very Machiavellian, powerful, meddling institution, that works, of course, hand in hand with the U.S. military and the CIA. And there's very little distinction between the 3 of them for any real terms. And the entire NATO bloc, NATO was founded as an organization, as a defensive. That's how it was imagined. It has never been used for defense, never. No collective defense has ever been mobilized against a state actor. The idea was to NATO would keep the U.S. in Europe, Germany down, and Russia out of Europe. And of course, with the end of the Cold War, that mission really doesn't exactly apply anymore, although they're doing their best to increase its tensions to where it might have some renewed relevance. But NATO has been instrumentally involved in all of the military operations that NATO has actually been used in as a tool of this global hegemony, as if you will, a political and organizational fig leaf for regime changes, for the exercise of often unilateral, illegal U.S. military force around the world. And that's why I think Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, I think he has an acute awareness of that. I don't know how much, I don't want to feed into his motivations completely how much of an info utopian he is, and how much of a cynic and a realist like me he is. But it's obvious, not just from his actions, but from any examination of his writings, that he's well aware of the hegemonic status of the U.S. and the danger it's presenting in trying to militarily hang on to that position, as the unipolar moment ends and multipolarity begins. And he's using WikiLeaks, as I see it, as a force for good to expose what are that hegemon's illegal, both under often international and domestic law excesses. And that is what draws me to WikiLeaks. As I see it as a force of geopolitical resistance.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And just briefly returning back to what you said about Kosovo and the KLA, and I know what you're talking about. I've personally reported on the European Council report about organ trafficking. It's a horrendous story that you do not hear about, even though it seems like it would be so important. But moving back to WikiLeaks, I'm curious, you mentioned all of these reasons, these really fantastic, powerful reasons to support WikiLeaks, and why is it that so many people in the kind of, unelected power structure and the military interests of the United States, even if they have kind of similar concerns about wanting to have some information not published, and they know privacy isn't really a thing that exists for them, is the real difference between, your stance on WikiLeaks and their stance against it? Is it more just that, as you say, that they are involved with and want to cover up these illegal activities? They benefit from those illegal activities, whereas you yourself, you don't, you obviously think that's a terrible thing. And so is that really the for or against? In other words, it's not whether you think that all information should be free or not. It's, are you for illegal activity or not? That's what I got from what you've told us.
Yeah. I think that's a fair assessment. When we're talking about the people, these institutions, and their moral compass, and why they continue to support it, I think you can look at two things. One, Upton Sinclair in the Jungle wrote about how that it's very hard to convince someone of something when their economic well-being, I'm paraphrasing him obviously, their economic well-being, their lifestyle depends on them not recognizing it, right? If their careers are made, you don't go back on that, obviously, or very few people. Ed Snowden, hats off to him. Private Manning, they both did things while serving that I did not have the conviction to do. I have a lot of respect for them that way. They had more access to information that was actually appropriate and damning, but I can't say that I don't regard myself of having participated in things that I find heinous and tantamount to war crimes and so on. So hats off to the people who have gone against those interests and have bucked the power vertical within those institutions of the U.S. government, and in Snowden's case, the CIA and the NSA, both the vast majority of their budget now, up to 74%, is actually the private sector, and a lot of people don't realize that, and that's right where Edward Snowden comes into the picture.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point.
The economic interest is one side, and of course the other side is the supremacist ideology of American exceptionalism, where and Madeleine Albright, has loud been one of the biggest and first voices, saying it quite as loudly, that when the U.S. does wrong, it isn't wrong because it's for good, all right? And we've recently heard that from Clapper. The former director of national intelligence under Obama. He's recently reiterated exactly that. when we meddle, when we interfere in other countries' politics, as Carnegie Mellon research papers have shown that the U.S., of course, is the biggest meddler in elections and political affairs in other countries in the world by far. And that it had done so 81 times just between the end of World War II and the year 2000. And that doesn't cover anything past 2000, where I think they've really put their foot on the gas pedal with regard to this. And it doesn't include actual regime changes and invasions and so on. So, every time I hear the accusations of meddling coming out from the U.S. towards anywhere else, I just have to stifle a little hypocritical chuckle at that. So this ideology of American exception is really, really, really poisonous, because at its heart, it really goes to foreign policy. And it says that the U.S. is not subject to international law and can never allow itself to be subject to international law, because that would put the interests of other states over the interests of the United States. And they believe that the U.S. not only has a duty, but has a moral right. They believe that their vision of the world, their society, is so superior to everything else that they have the right to impose, by whatever means, overt, covert, legal, illegal, their interests on the rest of the world, because their interests, they believe, inevitably at the end work as everyone's interests. The idea that deep down inside every black, yellow, red, whatever person out there in the world is a little liberal U.S. American consumer just waiting to be freed by their, be it information, their re-education, or directly by military means if it has to do that. We heard this all the way back to Vietnam, that you have to destroy a village to save it, and I regard that as a morally treacherous position. This extension of ideological and political universalism leads directly. It has no other possible end result but imperialism. And imperialism is a déclassé word anymore. We don't like to use it even when it's accurate, because people tend to shut down when they hear it. Oh, back to the Cold War and communist rhetoric. Well, they were right about that and a few other things, not right about everything. That's why I like to use the term hegemony or suzerainty to describe it. But it comes down to the same thing. An attempt to enforce what you see as universalism. You think your ideas, your values, your politics, your society are universal, equals imperialism when you try to force that by hook or crook on the rest of the world. And the U.S. has a whole range, whether that comes from Hollywood and soft power up to smart power, sharp power, economic power, the trade wars that the U.S. is trying to bludgeon the rest of the world pretty much into right now to try to shore up its own crumbling economy that has deteriorated as a result of its own neoliberal global capitalist architecture that it created. And right up to of course the covert and the military operations that we can see going on right now in Syria, in Yemen, and and overtly military even in the South China Sea. It's not the Caribbean Sea, it's not the Gulf of Mexico, it's on the other side of the Pacific, and it's off the coast of China. But the U.S. likes to park its Navy there very provocatively. That is all an extension of this belief in American exceptionalism. It is a hateful, supremacist ideology, and it is what drives a lot of these people. Never believe that these people, these liberals, neocons, humanitarian imperialists, and neocons are often just the flip side of the coin. Never believe that they're doing these things just for money or just out of cynicism. Most of them actually are believers. They believe in American exceptionalism. They believe in, their extension of its branch of its ideology, whether it's humanitarian interventionism, imperialism, or neoconservatism. They are often true believers, and if you doubt that, if you immediately assume that they're doing it just for money, that adds to it, of course. But I think you're not only doing yourself a disservice in judging the motivations of these people, but you're preventing a real analytical problem.
Yeah, I think that's a major point. And I think that when you're describing that concept, that ideology of American exceptionalism and, the way that translates into imperialism, I'm also reminded of that phrase, the world police, that America has assumed this role, wrongly in many people's view, as being this ultimate moral authority that is then going to enforce its ideology, as you've described in that imperialistic kind of sense.
It's of course not just police, it's police, judge, jury, and executioner.
Absolutely.
And this is not only a danger, of course, to the rest of the world, as no one has, or, asked them to assume this role, but it's to the detriment of U.S. citizens. And among all of the other poison, particularly toxic domestic policies and pettiness and criminality of the Trump government, one of the things that it has recognized is, or at least in its campaign rhetoric before the election, is that this pursuit of global military hegemony, of trying to act as policemen, etc., it all comes, of course, at the expense of the U.S. taxpayer. And when you wonder why you don't have nice things, why you don't have free college tuition, why you don't have health care, why your infrastructure, your roads and bridges are crumbling across the U.S. and social mobility gets ever harder. The U.S., the imperially overstretched U.S. military, trying to exert its military force across the entire world at this point, is a direct consequence of that. That is one of the huge outlays of U.S. spending, whether it's directly military, wars, which are always a separate line item in the budget, the intelligence services, which just often reinforce the same thing both domestically and foreign, and now we have things like Homeland Security and so on that go off into this. And there's of course a lot of money that we don't know how it's spent because it's black book budgets.
Definitely. And I think that, adding to that and moving forward from that kind of like macro, huge, bird's eye view of the situation, I really wanted to, ask, because of your background and your insight into geopolitical matters, I wanted to ask you about what you make of the pivot we've seen by Ecuador towards the United States, as in the wake of silencing Julian Assange, despite the fact that Lenin Moreno ran on, in part, supporting Julian Assange continuing his asylum in the Ecuadorian Embassy. Can you just describe to us, from your unique perspective, what you see in this ongoing escalation of the relationship between the United States and Ecuador? How that's happening, what's influencing it, and what do you see as the future of this relationship?
Yeah, of course, Moreno ran as a leftist, right? And then there is a huge amount of internal criticism coming domestically from in Ecuador that is not true, and that he's instituting, not foreign policy aside, but neoliberal domestic policies, shifting Ecuador away from the socialist vision that Rafael Correa had. But it's obvious that the new government in Ecuador is moving closer to the United States. What Moreno's personal, political beliefs are, is obvious that the U.S. has put immense economic and political pressure on Ecuador, as they do, with so many other countries. I mean, we've just heard Nikki Haley, screaming literally on the floor of the Security Council when countries vote away from the U.S. on such issues as Israel or everywhere, we're taking names, and everyone who voted against us will pay a price. Well, when you act against the United States with something as big and as publicly damaging as WikiLeaks, and the various whistleblowers it has published, Ecuador has put itself right into the firing line, and it seems that Moreno is backtracking, on not only on Assange, but a lot on the foreign policy course that Carrillo set, and drawing much closer to the United States. Now, Moreno, the Ecuadorian government, judges under its aegis have, in the last week, put out first, a detainment and now arrest orders for the former Ecuadorian president, Rafael Correa, who is currently, at least the last I read, in Belgium with his wife. And was doing what he could to resist being picked up by Interpol or under these orders or something. Obviously, this is a political attack, and I can't believe that it is coming on its own without the direct pressure from the United States to punish another leftist South American leader that dared to challenge U.S. power in its own hemisphere. And the implications that the arrest of Rafael Correa have for Julian Assange are unfortunately not very good. I don't mean to draw an overly somber note, but I do not have, that does not bode well for Julian. Because it was, of course, Rafael Correa who gave Assange not only political asylum, but sheltered him in the embassy under UK, acting as a sock puppet for the United States, siege, but that even granted him citizenship, and all of that is now called into question, and his long torture of complete isolation, not being able to use the internet, to talk to anyone, that unfortunately, I think that is not the end of this process. So Ecuador is drawing ever closer to the United States, and the one thing that they could most do to make the United States happy and reverse the measures it has set against Ecuador is serve up Julian Assange as a martyr.
Do you think that, and I agree, unfortunately, and not only have we seen that relationship between Ecuador and the United States kind of grow as we have the news breaking about the arrest ordered of Correa, but we also see within days of that, practically, the visit by the U.S. Vice President Pence to Ecuador, et cetera. So it's really, really unfortunate, the timing of all of that. I was wondering, with your experience in this kind of area, what do you think it would take to actually pressure Ecuador to continue to really support Julian Assange's, not only his asylum, but to restore his right to free speech and his right to speak to his family and friends and loved ones and to the world? Is there a possibility of public pressure from within Ecuador or from outside Ecuador to actually make a difference in that situation?
Yeah, I don't see any pressure that is capable of being delivered from within Ecuador. Moreno was elected. He does have control of all of the institutions. The Ecuadorian people have a lot more personally to worry about, in terms of economics and domestic affairs than Julian Assange. He's simply not a priority for them, as we in the first world often have a luxury to make such bigger political, and the information causes, part of our daily life. What would it take in the West to reverse this pressure? Sure, protests by millions in state capitals. Protests by millions in the street might provide breathing room.
Yeah, I know that that's something that Susie definitely wants to see. She wants this to snowball into that type of movement, and I can't say I'm against it. I hope that it does take off in that way. But it is really, really, truly saddening to see this type of, as you mentioned before, imperialism sort of creeping into a country which had been so unique in its ability to stand up to that immense pressure that you described from the United States.
For a brief shining Camelot moment, yes.
Yeah, and I mean that really was it. And not only is it just even if Assange was out of that equation, it was so unique to have any nation refuse the imperialistic kind of takeover by the United States.
Unfortunately, and then you add, it's not just Rafael Correa. We see that Luis de Silva, Dilma Rousseff, Ferdinand Cristina Fernandez, all of these leftist leaders, Venezuela is coming under, ever increasing pressure right now, with after the death of Hugo Chavez, and with evidently the news breaking this week that allegedly, within his own inner circle, that Trump is pushing his own people towards active military regime change, in Venezuela. That's just one more domino on what was a strong leftist South American bloc, that has all but fallen now.
Extremely unfortunate. And so then when we add, the added pressure that would come from any country, protecting, harboring, and providing citizenship to Julian Assange, I cannot imagine the pressure that has been on Ecuador for years.
Yeah. I mean, you can't place much blame with the Ecuadorian people. That they are in a tough situation. They're right in the U.S.'s backyard, and they are, of course, not a wealthy country. And they did try to chart another course, both economically and politically, and they're paying the price for it. And most of us haven't even come anywhere close to paying the price, for our own political beliefs, that Ecuador has, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a really important perspective that I know a lot of our viewers, we're as you say, we're not in Ecuador on the ground, and in some of these countries where those decisions have such a serious impact on their day-to-day lives. What, as a veteran, I know we discussed this a little bit in the last Vigil, but I want to touch on it again for anyone who wasn't watching then. What are some of the ways that specific WikiLeaks releases have really hit home for you? Whether it's the information published by Chelsea Manning, whether it's the cables. What are some of the most important and, I guess, noteworthy publications that for you in your mind?
Yeah, of course, the biggest shock to the system was, of course, what Private Manning, that was the initial blow, which really just confirmed with visual evidence, right, of U.S. war crimes in Iraq, things that were, previously people had been dismissed or called conspiracy theorists, even though it was perfectly obvious. This forced them to take a step back, as it were, because no one could deny what U.S. forces were up to in Iraq at that point. And and of course it was merely passed off as a few bad apples, and no one up the chain, either militarily or intelligence or political was ever in any way held to account. And it was Obama, that when he came to office and refused to consider prosecutions of anyone from the previous administration, be it for torture or other war crimes or so on. Again, with this idea of American impunity when it comes to international law, that even goes as far as domestic law. it's so often, you know, that Republican presidents have done terrible things, but then you come on the heels of Democratic presidents like Obama, you know, with rhetoric of hope and change that are actually much, much worse, because they then normalize what was done under Bush, and then extend it and carry it further, you know, where the drone program, you know, the extrajudicial, extraterritorial assassination of thousands of people around the world with double taps and signature strikes and so on, you know, only becomes the you know, the average, you know, the way to do business. It's normal business, and the media no longer even questions these things. Then often when a liberal president, you know, not only doesn't prosecute and not only continues them, but then extends them forward. And, you know, it's still common to, you know, condemn the Bush administration for Iraq, as it rightly should, but Libya and Syria and Yemen were all, of course, started under Obama. And, you know, the press has no such opprobrium, unfortunately, for, you know, what is nearly identical and often in many ways far more heinous acts of regime change and hegemony there. Some of the other publications, of course, the State Department cables, you know, we talked a bit about those in the book, you know, WikiLeaks, you know, the WikiLeaks files, the world according to the U.S. empire. We talked a bit about that last time. And I think everyone should read that book, because it reveals the way the State Department does business. I mean, such great revelations that, you know, have been completely undiscussed by the mainstream media in the West, such as, you know, Hillary Clinton and John Podesta talking back and forth that they knew that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were directly funding and militarily providing assistance to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and other groups in Syria and elsewhere, even as Saudi Arabia and Qatar were buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. arms, being feted, you know, as celebrities by U.S. politicians, and even part of the U.S.'s anti-ISIS coalition. It tells you how genuine, you know, that particular venture was. That was, you know, the fact that that didn't blow up, you know, politically, only shows the power of the fourth estate, you know, the media, in covering up, you know, what is a crime of our government and of other governments, simply by shoving it, you know, under the bed, under the carpet, and not addressing it, even when that information is staring in the face. And another thing is the rigging of the Democratic Party primary, which would, you know, calls into question, you know, it's not I don't see as anyone else attacking U.S. democracy. The U.S. is, you know, it's one of its own two primary parties of power, is doing a good enough job of subverting its own democracy, with no one held to account, with the former DNC chair just being picked up and hired by the, you know, the Clinton campaign. You know, no one is going to be tried. There was evidently no crime committed, because, you know, the Democratic Party's lawyers argued that, you know, they had the right to rig their own primary, evidently, as literally what they argued in court. So, you know, this, you know, the U.S. government has, of course, you know, said that WikiLeaks was just acting on behalf of a foreign government and all of this, that it didn't come from a whistleblower. Well, if it did come from a foreign government, which I don't believe for a second, but if it did, could there be any greater act of democratization against the U.S. than exposing the rigging of one of its, you know, two parties of power, of their own primary elections? I don't think so. I think that's a great act of democratization, whoever was responsible for it, and I thank WikiLeaks for publishing it. But there was something in particular that I wanted to talk about today, a WikiLeaks publication that I think hasn't drawn enough attention. and that is the book by Julian Assange, When Google Met WikiLeaks, which came out just a few years ago as Julian was entering into his besieged status in the embassy. And if you can't read that whole thing, there's an excellent lengthy excerpt online. Google is not what it appears. You can get it off of WikiLeaks. You can Google it even, and it still comes up, amazingly enough. It comes right across on WikiLeaks, or it was published in Newsweek originally somehow, and it's still out there. And this is, I think, a really important and scary piece that everyone needs to read and think about and digest, and then read again and think of the implications of this, because it shows the open collusion between these tech giants, Google, of course, not just one of them now, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, and the US government. And then Julian talks about them being, emerging suprastates of their own. Maybe that's their long-term intention, but I think actually what he shows is that they are simply extensions of the US government now. And I know that Unity4J has seen that itself as it's had its traffic, throttled by various social media organizations. But he very clearly details the depth of the collusion, where Google and the United States government are now just basically in a symbiotic relationship at this point. He describes a meeting, when he was still under house arrest in Norfolk in the UK, where the then executive chairman, previously the CEO of Google, wanted to come to talk to him. And he described this as the mountain coming to Muhammad. And of course, how could he refuse this? This big, powerful person. He describes him as a very intelligent man. His partner at the time, his romantic partner, was Lisa Shields, who, Julian later finds out is a vice president for the Council on Foreign Relations, which is, far more than just a think tank on foreign policy and international relations. It goes a long way to being just another branch of the State Department, where policies are both created and then where policies are then justified, to the world. The Council of Foreign Relations is essentially another branch of the U.S. government, of the State Department. Then also there was Jared Cohen, who at the time was heading up Google Ideas. Google Ideas was described as a think/do tank. And he goes on in the paper to describe Jared Cohen as basically Google's director of regime change. If I read a part here, there's another great WikiLeaks, of course, release was Stratfor emails. And I have to admit, I'm a victim of WikiLeaks, the Stratfor emails. When I was finishing up my postgrad work in London, I applied for a program at Stratfor. Often, they describe themselves often as the shadow, or corporate CIA. And I thought they might be a little bit realist, a little bit more open to, objective opinions. At the time, I was, terribly naive and all of that. But I sent them my CV, and eventually, after a few rounds, it got shut down over security reasons. I'm rather curious what that was all about. So, I'm a victim of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and I'm supporting him. You can find my CV out there, just by Googling it, WikiLeaks, and my name in Stratfor, it'll come right up. But I still, of course, support Julian Assange despite that. But the Stratfor files wrote about the emails from Stratfor, describing this Jared Cohen, who was with Google Ideas. He left Google ideas and went right into work for the State Department after that, the revolving door. Google is getting the White House and State Department support and air cover. In reality, they are doing things the CIA cannot do. Cohen is going to get himself kidnapped or killed, might be the best thing to happen to expose Google's covert role in foaming uprisings, to be blunt. The US government can then disavow knowledge, and Google is left holding the bag. And in further communications, Burton said his sources on Cohen activities, they were looking for something more concrete, and they see that he's intimately connected with the State Department. So Google is basically fomenting its own regime change operations, operating sometimes in parallel, sometimes on its own from the US government. Jared Cohen in particular is a big targeting Iran. As with Google, he is trying to create movements on Iran's border, of course, towards regime change. This was already years ago. And, of course, we see the Trump administration now gearing up in that direction full bore. So that's a little scarier. And the fourth person at their meeting was Scott Malcolmson, who was just described as the editor of the book they were writing and interviewing Julian Assange about. But right after he finished with Google, he went right to work for Susan Rice in the State Department, or at the UN from the State Department, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, as a principal advisor and speechwriter. So Julian Assange wasn't just meeting with Google; he was meeting with Google and the U.S. blob, the U.S. foreign policy elite. And Google was basically just a backdoor channel of diplomacy, espionage, however you want to look at it, from the US government to Julian Assange. And that shows how much these things are intersecting now. It goes far beyond collusion. They're essentially the same entity. And when we see, Google in recent days, deranking and downlisting alt media sources left and right, the media of any government that dares, question more, shall we say, or challenge, the U.S. government narrative on anything, we can see that there's no longer even any doubt. Julian Assange was ahead of the game in recognizing this and seeing it. Facebook just formed a partnership with the DFR labs, Digital Forensics Research Labs, which are a separate new information security group set up by the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is funded by the U.S. government or of governments, is the think tank / Gongo government organized non-governmental organization of NATO. So there's so much, it's not just cross-pollination. It is symbiosis at this point. These big tech giants, Amazon, Jeff Bezos, he bought his own newspaper, the Washington Post, no friend of Julian Assange there. They are in a symbiotic relationship where the U.S. government is now sending its tendrils around the world through these tech giants who have power over huge portions of the world now, and vice versa. Because, of course, these tech giants are putting their own utopian, dystopian vision of how they can create a new humanity, as Google has talked about it, a new human being, a new world. They talk about themselves as reforming nations. They view themselves as just serving as the global policeman at this point for companies like Google and Facebook and so on. Oh, that's so ancient. That's such ancient thinking. That's such small thinking. They completely want to rewrite the narrative DNA of the world at this point. So it's a symbiosis that goes both ways. These people are putting their tendrils into the U.S. government. And I read it, really, just this excerpt, if not the whole book. It's scary. And, unfortunately, it leads us to talk about, eventually we're going to be driven out of the internet, maybe into the dark web or what have you, certainly off of social media. Whether we're talking alt media, be it the sane far left, the coherent far left, the sane alt right, representatives of media from governments that do try to question U.S. narratives. We've got to think about where we go, and we need to have that conversation of a fallback plan for exodus and setting up our networks before we all get completely cut off, whether it happens one by one or all in a sudden deluge, so we don't lose connection with each other. And I think it's inevitably, unfortunately, going to lead to ghettoization, but at least hopefully we can find ways of keeping contact with each other. And even if we lose the wider audience that we have been able to reach to some extent thus far with social media, and they're trying to tamp down on that.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the subject of what Julian Assange has written about Google and its interaction with the State Department, because that is so key in informing our our understanding that follows on from that, as you described, the way in which Google has censored independent media and also, as you mentioned, anti-war sites, whether they're libertarian or whether they're leftist. We have seen them really strangle through algorithm altering the viewership of all of these different websites, news outlets, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly through YouTube, we've seen the demonetization of people like Tim Black, who I just spoke to earlier. So I think that
Julian goes a step forward, and he calls these tech giants an existential threat to humanity. Because, of course, the way that these things will all be controlled, monitored, controlled, is that through ever increasing use of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And
absolutely
ending up in a role that these are escaping, even the bits of control that we have, and we have machines deciding, program machines, hopefully, but machines deciding what information is safe for us to look at. They're deciding on our information security, and they are the ones, forming the narrative at this point. When you go from the State Department to dystopian technoghark, James Bondian type crazy villain men, then straight up into machine learning and artificial intelligence, I think that should scare everyone. It scares me.
Yeah, and I know that artificial intelligence was one of the major subjects that Julian Assange has warned us about multiple times before he was isolated. He has really, hammered that home as something that we should be concerned about. And, when we talk about, again, when we talk about all of the censorship that you're describing, both that has happened and is going to likely continue to happen in your view, it is so critical that people see that not just as, Google, a technocratic giant, but as Julian Assange has pointed out, so deeply involved directly with the US State Department and its unelected military interests. So that perspective, I'm so glad that you brought that up, and especially because Julian Assange cannot speak out himself right now. I think that every time that, people during this vigil, like yourself, bring up his words and the text that he has authored, that is really, really, I think, valuable and important to discuss. Because we're all here to support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and to reconnect him, but really going over the things that he's already said is helpful for everyone. So thank you so much for bringing that up for our consideration.
Yeah, I think we're all responsible for picking up Julian's standard at this point, under siege, whatever may happen to him, and carrying, the fight forward in whatever way we individually can. But, to do that, you really have to be aware of, I think, the whole breadth of Julian Assange, very important, political writings. I think he is far, of course, he's talked about as a privacy advocate and, a journalist and a whistleblower. He is a political thinker. He is maybe the first big figure of what hopefully could become a global movement of resistance. One would hope at some point.
I completely agree. And thank you so much for spending your time with us. I am just floored by the amazing people that are willing to spend their Saturday and Sunday discussing this really important issue. Thank you. And thank you for the segment you spent with us in the last Vigil. And I look forward to seeing you again next time, if we have to, unfortunately, have yet another Vigil in support of Julian Assange. Thank you, Mark. It's
been an honor and a pleasure to be among such an assemblage, left, right, up, down, whistleblowers, former military, an incredible group of people, and I'm just honored to have had a small voice among them.